history of Hornell. The beginning. To understand the history of Hornell, you first have to understand the people who first settled in this area.
Phelps and Gorman. The 1 million acres of land Hornell was part of the Phelps and Gorman Agreement with the 6 nations of Native American at Buffalo Creek.
Sean Hogan, previous mayor of Hornell for 32 years.
And there was a settlement there in Wilkes-Barre, and the Indians and the British wiped out that community. So General Washington asked General Sullivan to go take revenge on the perpetrators, which were the British and the Indian fighters in this area. So they had what they call Sullivan's March. And if you'll see down by Elmira, there was a Revolutionary War battlefield. The march continued, and it went up to if you can see, signs up by Canisius Lake that says this is the route of Sullivan's troops. So all these troops that came up here weren't familiar with this area, and so that was their first view of the rural or wilderness in New York State, and the Elmiras and they didn't exist. So they after the Revolutionary War, a lot of the soldiers that served with General Sullivan were given land grants, and a lot of them. There was the first one. There was Benjamin Crosby that came here, and he settled to build a place down by where the old St. James Hospital was. He settled in there, and there were others. There was the oldest house in Steuben County down in Canisteo, Bellhaven. McBurney, he was an officer in the Revolutionary War. And if you go in that house one time, we did a historical tour. There is still a bullet or a ball from the old musket that's lodged in that door, and it's still there. It's amazing. So they settled here. Benjamin Crosby and others, Bennett, and there was a bunch of other, and they called it Hornell. They called it this area Upper Canisteo and Lower Canisteo, which included Canisteo and Hornell and Hartport. And then after the war, as things started to progress, it was a rural area, very remote. It grew over time, and they incorporated the town, and which Hornell was part of the town, but it was a more central, the population base here because of the river and how the river came around and how business and commerce, they started grist mills and things like that, and we'll get into that. One of the first grist mills was started by George Hornell, who came here and started the mill, and his house still exists. And Melissa Ponicello and Todd Ponicello, who was a teacher at the high school, they own that house where George Hornell built and supposedly lived. So George Hornell wasn't one of the first settlers, but he became one of the more prominent settlers because he was a businessman with the first grist mill and the grinding corn and things of that nature. Then he became a representative, state representative, and things of that nature. And there's a whole history in and of himself with the George Hornell. In fact, his grave and his wife's graves are up here in the rural cemetery, and they're placed in such a situation where they overlook the valley. All right, so to try to make a long story shorter, Hornell began to thrive, but it wasn't really until Jay Gould, who started the Erie Railroad, decided he wanted to build the fastest route from New York City to Chicago. And he began building the railroad up from Harriman, New York, all the way up through Hornell. And Hornell was situated in the place, location. It was kind of halfway between where they started and where they were going. So they selected Hornell as a major terminus for the Erie Railroad, which meant the railroad's coming opens up markets and transportation opportunities for the people that lived here and for business opportunities. And so after that, when the railroad came here in 1851, the railroad came through. They established Hornell as their major car shops, where a variation of that exists today at Alstom. That big building back there, that's not the original, but a portion of it was, because things changed over time, but they built the major rail car facility and locomotive repair shop there. They also, over time, established their headquarters for accounting.
Oliver Harding came next and settled in the land between Main and Genesee Streets, near where Hicks Avenue is now located. He was the nearest soldier of Mr. Crosby. He was a soldier of the Revolution.
Solomon Bennett. Solomon Bennett was one of the 12 partners who purchased the wrong part of land. He bought the area of Hartsville and then exchanged it for the Hornell area.
Benjamin Crosby. Benjamin Crosby and his family were the first recorded settlers in the Hornell area on the site of where the old St. James Hospital was.
Benjamin Crosby had his place up down by the St. James Hospital, and he had a friend who was an Indian who lived up by the Seneca Street Bridge up here, by Preston Avenue. And Benjamin Crosby, and you're talking after the 1780s, 1790s, this is wilderness. And Benjamin Crosby invited his Indian friend down for dinner at his place of residence, and he served him a 3-course meal. To show his friendship and his hospitality. To reciprocate, the Indian invited Benjamin Crosby up to his place of residence, up by Preston Avenue, and he served a 3-course meal. All 3 courses were succotash, but succotash is a mixture of different vegetables.
The Turnpike Road. In 1809, the Turnpike Road was laid from Ithaca to Lee, making more traffic through Hornellsville.
The first schoolhouse. The first schoolhouse, built within the limits of this city, stood on the south side of Main Street, near the head of Pardee Street. It was built in 1813. The first teacher was Dudley Miller. Uriah Stevens Jr. and George Hornell, the younger, were also teachers.
And also, at that time in this country, we weren't immune from some of the worst aspects of our society. Slavery. Slavery in the country was legal at that time. And we had people come here and settle in our valley that owned slaves. And they, at one time, there was a cemetery for slaves that's located, everyone talks about it, but there was a cemetery specifically for slaves somewhere between here and Canisteo in there. And it's recorded in history, but no one knows where that is.
The town of Hornellsville. The town of Hornellsville was officially formed on April 1st, 1820.
1826, Hornellsville population. In 1826, the Hornellsville population was 125 people with 25 houses, a tavern, a store, a gristmill, and a sawmill.
The Erie Railroad. In 1839, land was being surveyed and considered for construction of the Erie Railroad. Land was also considered, but Hornell was chosen to be the hub of the Erie Railroad.
1850 Hornellsville population. In 1850, only 7 years' time, the population had more than doubled in size from 300 to 700 people. The village contained 100 houses, 2 churches, 2 schools, a hotel, and 1 store.
Erie locomotive. In 1850, the first Erie locomotive came into Hornellsville, an orange number 4. It won a 20-mile race with a stagecoach. The president comes to Hornellsville. On May 14, 1851, the first passenger train to travel the entire length of Erie, from Piermont-on-Hudson to Dunkirk, arrived in Hornellsville with President of the United States Millard Fillmore and the Secretary of State Daniel Webster on board.
The Erie Railroad. In 1851, the population of Hornellsville was about 700. When the Erie Railroad came to town in 1852, the population had increased to 1,841.
Fire Department. On September 25, 1852, the Hornellsville Fire Department and Police Commission was first organized.
Bank of Hornellsville. In 1856, Samuel Hallett opened the Bank of Hornellsville with $100,000 capital and authorized to issue currency.
1865 population. 1865 population of Hornellsville, 5,338. Postage stamps were 3 cents.
The census. 1880, the census counted 8,195 people living within the village of Hornellsville.
1890 population. In 1890, the census recorded 11,000 people living within the city of Hornellsville.
Factories of Hornellsville. In 1891, Hornellsville had grown to contain 3 large hotels, 4 banks, 5 silk mills, a planing mill, a sash factory, a flour mill, a tannery, 2 fence and cable factories, a carriage works, a creamery, a machine gear works, several woodworking factories, a fairground with a horse racing park, a shoe factory, and an opera house. The Erie Railroad. The Erie Railroad merged with the Delaware, Lackawanna, and Western Railroad, becoming the Erie-Lackawanna Railroad. The company accounting office in Hornell was closed.
Decline of Hornell. When the Erie Railroad hub left Hornell, there was a steady decline of industry jobs and population.